Hello. This week we're covering some themes relating to how humans live together and how do humans best actualize their potential. And one of the ways we're looking at this theme is the notion of individuality and community, right? On the one hand, there's this unique essence, this unique potential within every human being that can be cultivated and developed. On the other hand, humans belong to societies and traditions. Everyone watching this video is the inheritor of centuries and millennia of ideas and languages and words and customs and norms that all combine to give you a sense of who you are, a sense of belonging to a culture. And one of the great debates in terms of human nature is what is more significant? That individual potential that's there at every time, or the cultural and customs and norms that make a society cohesive, right? How should we understand the human self, and what's the proper balance between individual and community? And we're going to explore that by looking at two figures who are on opposite sides. One, John Stuart Mill, an English philosopher who I'll be talking about in this video, and another, Confucius, who is known by his Latin term Confucius, which is the term I'll use because one most of you are most familiar with, who's a Chinese philosopher who strongly advocated for the importance of community and roles and norms and customs and adhering to those. And both philosophers have had a really strong influence, right? Confucian values are popular wherever China's had an influence. So all of Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan. And John Stuart Mill's perspective has been very influential where anywhere liberalism's been strongly influential. So we'll transition now to John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is an English philosopher who lived during the 1800s. He was born in 1806 or so, and he lived to about 1880. And why is he so influential? Well, when you take ethics, you'll deal with his ethical theory, utilitarianism, which is a very important ethical theory. But in terms of this class, he's one of the strongest advocates for individual liberty and its importance. He's the one who really articulated a lot of the arguments for free speech being a cultural value, right? So there was a time, maybe especially 10 years ago, but it's still popular and it's still popular now, with debates about freedom of speech, right? One of the ways the United States we're dealing with our cultural conflict is, shouldn't I be able to say what I want, right? Do we value freedom of speech? Are we suppressing freedom of speech? How is that dangerous or good or bad, all those things? Well, one of the things that's very clear is that the issue of freedom of speech is not about the original amendment, the First Amendment. The First Amendment only protects you from the government. The government cannot punish you or arrest you or tax you extra because you voice opinions that the government doesn't like, right? And so most of us are debating about freedom of speech. We're not talking about the government and whether or not the government should censor certain people or not. We're generally talking about our cultural values, our pop culture, the way we live together, the communities we form together. And one of the biggest proponents that freedom of speech should be a cultural value, not just a political value, was John Stuart Mill. So the essay above, which you read on individuality, is where he goes and argues in favor of free speech as a cultural value, that it's what's best for society in general, not just as a political value, but that it actually helps society develop and progress. But he pairs that freedom of speech essay with another essay about the importance of individuality in general. This is why the overarching book that you're reading a section from is called On Liberty. Because he's arguing that, hey, you know what? We've had democracy for, not very long in England, but it seems like we're kind of forgetting what the values of individualism and liberty is and what level it should be at. And what he talks about is that in democracy, there's a risk of something he calls the tyranny of the majority. And the tyranny of the majority is the idea that people in a group can suppress other people's opinions and thoughts, right? So if you take one person you have 100 other people, and there's 101 people, and the 100 people disagree with that one person, they can repress them. They can say, oh, we don't like that person. We're not going to invite them to things. We're not going to empower them. We're going to criticize them and mock them. We're not going to hire them because of their opinion or their perspective. We're going to ostracize them, right? And John Stuart Mill says, yeah, there's nothing in the Constitution that protects against that, because it's not the government doing it. It's the people, the everyday people who don't want to deal with difference. And so he says, I need to write and explain what is the value of individual difference? What is the value of individual opinions? Even though people may not like them, even though people may find them offensive, even though people might find them horrifying, right? And so Mill advances something which has become extremely popular in a lot of liberal societies. And he says, hey, all this essay, stuff on freedom of speech, individuality, all this can be boiled down to one simple principle. And we call it the harm principle now in philosophy and political theory. He says, the only reason that an individual's liberty should be restricted is to prevent that person from harming someone else. So that's it. That's the standard for liberty. Are you going to hurt somebody else? Then we can stop you. If you're not going to hurt anyone else, we shouldn't do anything to you. We should let you do whatever you want, because that's what's best for society. And as you can see, that's very influential in a lot of liberal societies. Libertarians, as a political party, kind of take that the strongest in one direction. But generally, a lot of people, especially in millennial and Gen Z and other generations, they often have that feeling that, hey, if you're not hurting anybody, why should someone stop you? Now, that's different than a lot of other worldviews, perspectives will say, hey, we can't, certain things we just shouldn't allow to be said. Certain things shouldn't allow to not just, you can't do it, right? If someone is, there might be some sort of say that, hey, if someone is gay, that's bad. And it's going to invoke the wrath of God, and we need to suppress that. We need to prevent that, right? And there might be other groups who say, hey, if someone doesn't like the idea that they don't like people being queer, but they don't have any particular, hurtful agenda towards them, they just don't like the idea of it. Some people might say, well, even that's wrong. We can't have people believing that, because if there's enough of them, it'll damage the people who are queer, right? And so John Stuart Mill said that, no, everyone should be able to say what they want as long as they're not harming others, right? And of course, as you might be feeling from this, what I'm explaining, one of the big weaknesses in Mill's thinking about the harm principle is what counts as harm. He's mostly concerned with physical harm, right? Like rioting or attacking people or stealing from people, encouraging people to do that, saying, hey, we should attack that person. We should harm that person, right? He says that's bad. But anything that's verbal or an idea, he thinks like, hey, if someone's a Nazi, if someone's a communist, if someone's anything, they should be able to say whatever they want and express themselves however they want, right? Even though their views might be offensive, right? Or something he was concerned with at that time was being an atheist, right? Which has been extremely controversial. And people have viewed it as extremely harmful to say yourself, I don't believe in God. And to try to tell others that you shouldn't believe in God. A lot of people believe that, like, you're seriously harming someone's soul. Like if an atheist goes out there and convinces someone else not to believe in God, they basically condemn that person to hell, right? So we have to suppress these kinds of things. And people don't always know what's best for themselves. So it's in this context that we're going to look at what he says about individuality, because we want to say, hey, look, this might seem uncomfortable to a lot of people, and the level of freedom of expression and organization development and the kind of maybe uncontrolledness of all this individuality might seem frightening to people, but it really is what's best for society, right? So we'll talk about what he argues in there. So the first part is that he says that customs, norms, traditions, they're good. They're great for making sure that every human being doesn't start from scratch, right? Every human being needs the collective wisdom of the society of behind them, right? There's lots of things that we've learned over the past centuries or millennia that a human needs to know, right? You wouldn't want to just take somebody and say, okay, kid, you're born, go figure it all out, right? We're not going to tell you anything that society has learned over the past 2,000, 3,000 years. We're just going to let you figure out from scratch because you have a brain and you're intelligent and you're human. Everyone knows that's crazy, right? You need a certain standard to be able to function well, and you benefit from that wisdom. But he's concerned is when people just let the inertia of society stop themselves from thinking and from developing well, right? He says it's only when you really figure out something for yourself that you actually use your full faculties. He used that term. It's a term they use then a lot. By faculties, he means your brain, all its capacities, right? Your emotions, your depth of feeling, your reflection, all the things that make you human. You use them the most when you are acting as an individual on your own, right? Think about times when you might have had to think to do something that maybe other people disagreed with, right? And maybe it wasn't necessarily even you got in an argument with people, but maybe just you knew a lot of other people weren't going to do what you were going to do or weren't thinking the way you were thinking. What John Stuart Mill says, well, you had to think harder, right? If someone challenged you, you had to debate them or present reasons for why you're doing this. Some of you, your family or friends might be like, why are you going to Gonzaga? Right? Some of you are coming from other countries. Some of you are coming from other places in the United States, and people might say, why are you going all the way over there to go to school? Right? And you might have to say, well, here's why I want to do this and these types of things and all that stuff. And so you developed yourself. But imagine if you had just went along with everybody else who was just saying, oh, this is just what's normal. I'm just going to do what everyone else does. I'm not going to think too hard about it. Right? Well, Mill says that weakens society. Right? He says when individuals are allowed to do things that are different, on the one hand, that's the ways that develops your own mind. But also, when you encounter someone else who maybe is doing the normal thing and you have to argue or debate about it, or you might see someone living very different than you somewhere, right? And you have to wonder, okay, well, what's bad about what they're doing, right? Or what's good about what I'm doing? You have to think about it. He says you don't want people to just follow without thinking, right? So that's one thing. He says, look, without really taking things on as an individual, he says you don't need anything more than the ape-like skill of imitation, right? You're closer to an animal when you're just following these. It's like he says gorillas and apes can do that kind of stuff. It's not really, humans really show our humanity and being able to think through and make choices on our own, right? Now, the other thing he's concerned about is passions and desires, because that's one of the things that, especially during that time of the 1800s, people are skeptical of desires, right? Think about the Christian context, right? Where a lot of your desires are considered to be sinful or things you need to repress or wrestle with in favor of a established authority like the church tells you to, like, here's how you should feel, here's how you should think. And you have a lot of desires that are counter to that, but that's because you're a sinner, right? You have sin, you have this original sin from St. Augustine, his theology, right? You deviated, at some point, Adam and Eve deviated from God, and now there's a part in you that wants to deviate from what's good, and it's the church and the church community that helps you stay on the straight path. You're going to feel things and think things that you shouldn't, right? You can't trust yourself. And Mill says, well, no, like having strong desires and strong passions is great. He says that's where we get people who are energetic, the kind of people who go out and make change in the world and invent things and are heroic, right? Strong passion and desires are not bad in themselves, but they need to be paired with an equally strong mind, right? He says, yeah, of course, the people with strong passions do some of the worst things, but they also do some of the best things, right? And we shouldn't be trying to get people to repress their desires too much. Instead, we should be trying to train people on how to think more clearly. But as you can understand from what Mill says, there's going to be some situations where bad things are going to happen. But he says that's the only way to get the good things out of people, is to give them a chance to do something that maybe doesn't turn out well, right? But if they're not intentionally harming others, we shouldn't stop them because we don't know how it will go, right? So he says that it's actually by letting people follow their passions with a true sense of reason, right, that they will help society the most. He says you need, and this is also why he says you do need some traditions and norms, because he says that kind of tradition, culture helps people oriented towards a greater good, right? When you're raised to know there's something broader than you, a tradition, a history you're a part of, well, then you're going to be not as selfish, even if you're following your heart or your own individual desires, right? But we shouldn't be suppressing what people feel they want to do. So he says kind of that on the one hand, that seems to be a good enough argument, right? That if this is the best way to develop people by letting them fulfill their passions and think for themselves, then we don't need any other arguments. But he says, I'm going to give a few more about how society benefits. But the main thing he says, he has this quote. He says that a human being is not like a machine, but like a tree that grows organically, right? People think it'd be crazy to go and take a tree that's outside somewhere and try to force it to grow in a particular mold. Everyone understands that a tree needs to grow however it grows. And if you go in a forest, if you go walk around your neighborhood or campus, you see trees take all kinds of different shapes in their branches and things like that, because that's how they're growing. It's organic. And so he says that when we restrict people's individuality, we limit their potential as humans. This is why I'm taking this in the human nature class, because for Mill, he says individuality is where it's at. That is where human beings reach their potential. That is what we get the most out of human beings. That is when they're most human, is when they're acting from their own thoughts, their own reasons, and their own feelings, right? This is why, once again, he says this is why the harm principle is the main principle we should operate on in our society. If you're not hurting someone else, just let somebody do what they're doing. So then he says, well, how is this going to benefit society, right? Because a lot of people are like, okay, well, even if maybe it's good for individuals, it's still not clear how this helps society in any kind of way, right? If the societal benefits of making everyone conform to certain norms or customs or traditions is better for stability and growth, then it might be something we need to sacrifice. But Mill has a couple arguments. The first is that he says we could learn something from them. Society can learn, right? He says this in an earlier part of the book, which you didn't read, but he says there's so many things that people thought were evil or wrong that now we consider normal, right? And so how would you know? Like, I'll give a good example. There are now households where both men and women work, right? We can say there are certain societies, even in the United States not too long ago, where that would have been viewed as kind of a bad thing that the woman works. And the man should be the breadwinner. The woman, if any, because women have always worked a lot in the United States. But oftentimes there's an idea that it was an unladylike thing, or they were lower class, or all these kinds of things, right? The ideal was that the woman would be at home and the man would be working. And so a lot of the elite people in society would have been like, that's a horrible thing to allow women to be professors or to be lawyers or have major influence in society. If they're laborers, well, that's because they're low class, right? A lot of women have been low class, have been farmers and factory workers and things like that, right? But to allow a woman to be a professor or to be a priest or a pastor or a senator, that's wrong. That's horrible. That would destroy society. People literally believe that. A lot of people did, right? Now it's considered normal, right? We have a vice president and no one even really cares. Well, I mean, there are probably people who are upset about that. But generally, it's not considered a horrible thing that there's senators and vice presidents and prosecutors and judges and CEOs who are women. So, but most people would argue that idea that women can do these jobs was true. It was a good thing. It was true even when everyone else disbelieved it back in the day, right? So the example says, well, we should just let people do what they want. If someone wants to live in a lifestyle that is controversial, you never know what it'll be. We don't know what now, 100 years, 200 years from now, something might seem really strange to us that will be also be perfectly normal. We'll be like, wow, I can't believe people, did that, right? Or people like were against that. And we don't necessarily know what it is. So he says, as long as you're not harming someone else, right? A good example of this is, for example, there are people out there who are now getting married to robots that they built. You can look up some of them. I think there's one in China. I think there was one in Canada and some other places. That might seem very bad or weird or strange if someone marry a robot that they made, right? But Mill would say, hey, they're not hurting anybody, so let it be. Maybe 200 years from now, lots of people will do it and they'll consider it normal. Or it could be wrong. It could be wrong. It could be a bad thing. And these people suffer emotionally and psychologically. They don't develop well and all these things. But then society will actually learn. We'll have concrete examples as opposed to being afraid or fearful, preventing things, right? We'll just say, we know, like, 50, 500, 5,000, a million people tried it and it was really bad. So society learned. But for Mill, we learn in an organic way. The second thing that for Mill, he says more, but one of the second things I want to note on is that he says that genius is inherently tied to individuality. So if someone has genius or is a genius, they're going to act erratic. They're going to act differently than everyone else. So there's a quote that says that talent hits the target no one else can hit. Genius hits the target no one else can see. That's the difference, right? You can be a genius and not be talented, right? You can be a genius and not be that intelligent, right? Genius has to do with seeing things that other people can't see, whereas talent has to do with hitting a certain standard. Now, some people, many of the people that we consider geniuses are also very talented, right? But the reason why I give that quote is because people who have genuine genius perceive the world differently than those around them. And so society can't have its cake and eat it too, Mill will say, right? You can't say, we want the development, the inventions, the ideas, the organization, whatever skill this genius has, the arts, whatever, the music, the food, the new ideas in food, we want that, but we also want you to be just like everyone else, right? We don't want you to disrupt society. We don't want you to be really different or live differently or act differently. We want you to be just like everyone else, but still produce the genius gifts for us, for society, right? He says it just isn't going to work that way. If a person truly is a genius, they're going to feel and experience the world very different than those around them, and they might have to live very differently, right? In a very different manner. They might never get married, which nowadays isn't as a strange phenomenon, but in the 1800s, it would have been a very controversial thing for someone to say, hey, I'm never getting married. I'm just living on my own, right? Or someone might just eat a whole lot of junk food because they have something with their sense and they just only want to eat junk food. And it's really bad for the health, but they're a computer genius and they're inventing these new things on the computer that are revolutionizing certain things, but something about their body and function, they just have this taste where they only like these fast food things because they were raised on it as a kid. And yeah, that guy might die at 55 of a heart attack, right? But that's what's needed for them to be who they are and give the gift of their intelligence, right? So who are we to say, hey, person, you need to eat healthy and do all these other things that we want you to do, if it's, for Mill would say, if it's going to cost us that person's genius, talent, or ability, right? So to reiterate, there's a couple things. He says, one, that society can learn from people being individuals and doing what they want. They either learn something good that they didn't know, right? That we like, wow, that actually isn't a bad thing, right? Society can improve. Or we can learn by seeing how it fails. Say, wow, okay, that person's lifestyle was really bad. That person's ideas didn't really work out. Okay, now we know. For Mill, individuality is the engine of social progress. It's individuals that are willing to act differently what's normal, right? He says there's a lot of things in society that are bad, right? And someone has to be kind of different to say, hey, that's wrong, right? We shouldn't be doing this. We should do something different. I'm going to criticize this, or I'm going to. He says you need that in society to help it grow in progress. If everyone says, no, we've been doing this for 500 years, you're the one who's wrong, well, then society won't progress. The second thing he says is genius. Genius, these leaps of insight, these leaps in thought, like I said, in all across cultural frames, are tied to people being different. Geniuses aren't just more intelligent than other people. They see the world differently than other people. They experience reality different than other people. Right? That's why some people are geniuses in music, some people are geniuses in sports, some people are geniuses in all kinds of areas, sciences. But the fundamental thing is to be a genius is not the same as being very talented, but to just see a different possibility. And for Mill, the only way you can see a different possibility is to be different. Now, the final thing he says is more about governance and society. He says that oftentimes, even in democracy, even though, yeah, democracy cares about everybody's vote mattering and all that stuff like that, but he says in most governments, it's often been unique individuals who really rise up and guide others. He says, I can understand if back in the aristocratic days or the church-controlled days where you have the masses of people and you control their thinking, but the people are controlled by very intelligent people, right? For example, the Catholic Church was full of people who had to learn a lot of languages and customs and ideas and science to then guide the masses, right? So he says, but now that we've kind of deconstructed those, he says most people are being guided by someone who's just as average as they are, right? They're not exceptionally thinking. They're just maybe louder or fit with what everyone else thinks, and so they agree. He says you need people to be true leaders to kind of stand out and be different. And he says, I'm not talking about hero worship, where there's like a tough guy who doesn't, going to take power and doesn't listen to anybody. He's like, I'm not talking about that, but just that people who are truly cultivated and intellectual and insightful are people who any society rise up and become leaders, and other people look towards them for guidance. He says it's even more important to develop individuality now that we have democracy, because we've empowered the average citizen. And the average citizen, in his mind, is an average person. And that's what most people are. And so now we have this risk where the standard of thinking of what's leading society sinks down to what is average, right? And so he says we need to make sure that we support and project, not just protect them, but to project them out, to give them support and development, these individuals who can kind of guide society in different directions, right? So we can learn. So in that, we're going to close the discussion of John Stuart Mill. I hope you gain more insights into liberalism's cultural philosophy and the role of individuality, and that perhaps some of these things make sense. See you in the next video.